welcome to another episode of Land Matters, a new podcast from the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy. We're a think tank based in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and I'm your host, Anthony Flint. In this series, we take a look behind the scenes at what really makes cities tick, the policies and innovations we're seeing in booming metropolitan regions all around the country and all around the world. More often than not, the key elements of more sustainable, equitable, and livable cities can be traced back to land. Today's topic draws from an article in our magazine Landlines, and by the way, you can find Landlines by going to our website, lincolninst.edu. We're also on Twitter at @landpolicy. The headline is Backyard Brouhaha, and it's a look at the Yes in My Backyard movement. Comes out of a palpable sense of frustration that's boiled over in places like the Bay Area about the lack of affordable housing. Yes in My Backyard, or YIMBY for short, has a simple message: build more supply of housing and prices will eventually moderate, as a basic economic law of supply and demand. The YIMBYs, with some justification, have had it with the NIMBYs, those established residents who say, not in my backyard. They're against height and density and multifamily housing. They're worried about views and congestion and parking. Many would say about different demographics in their midst. They don't want things to change, and so they use local land use regulations and endless hearings to fend off new housing. That's obviously a problem because cities across the country need more housing and lots of it. American cities have become hubs of innovation and economic powerhouses, and all of that is at risk if only the very rich can live there. There's a huge missing middle of housing, not luxury penthouses, but not subsidized housing either. So new groups are saying, yes, in my backyard. No problem, come on in, by all means, let's build that new housing, multifamily housing clustered around transit, the added benefit being that's sustainable development. What could possibly go wrong? Well, it turns out quite a lot. There's been a backlash against the YIMBY movement, emerging primarily over concerns about gentrification and displacement. The objection is that in low-income neighborhoods and communities of color especially, new building tends to make these places get discovered, and before you know it, they're serving $8 donuts and the rent is ridiculously high. On the ground, in a short period of time, those laws of supply and demand seem to be getting defied. So a bill in California, for example, last year that fast-tracked dense development got shouted down, with one person saying it was essentially a declaration of war on the poor. So what's next for the YIMBY movement? And how can cities develop policies to be more inclusive and diverse and to get people into affordable housing? With us to bring clarity to all this is housing advocate Randy Shaw of San Francisco. He's author of Generation Priced Out: Who Gets to Live in the New Urban America? It's published by the University of California Press. Randy, welcome to Cambridge and the Lincoln Institute.
Happy to be here.
So before we get into what's been happening with the YIMBY movement, tell us about the basic premise of your book and what prompted you to write it.
Well, I actually wrote this book out of a particular incident, the December 2nd, 2016 ghost ship fire in Oakland, where 36 mostly young people died in a warehouse. And that incident really shook me because even though I work in housing every day, I run the largest housing provider for homeless single adults in San Francisco, so I do know the crisis. Oakland had always been seen the alternative, affordable alternative to San Francisco. And when I see 36 people living in substandard developments and artists and bohemians can't even afford to live in Oakland in safe housing, it said to me that our progressive blue cities like Oakland, Berkeley, and San Francisco had done something seriously wrong. And as I started writing the book about the Bay Area, I realized that it was the same thing I was finding in those cities were happening in Cambridge and then Austin and then Seattle and Los Angeles. So I ended up writing about a dozen cities where the very similar problems that are causing their housing crisis.
And a lot of it has to do with established residents saying we don't want any more housing, we don't want different kinds of neighborhoods, we don't want neighborhoods to change their zoning uses. What's been happening out there so that we have not gotten this supply of housing.
Right. Well, the premise of and the thesis of generation priced out is that cities have to do two things. They have to protect tenants' rights and rental housing, and they have to build housing. And none of the cities that I write about are adequately doing that. I mean, San Francisco does the best job in America protecting tenants and rental housing, and one of the worst jobs in building housing. Seattle has been great at building housing now, but they don't have any right to have rent control under state law. So that's what cities have to do. And when you see cities that one thing they almost all the cities I write about have in common, one thing they all have in common is powerful, politically influential homeowners who prevent housing from being built in their neighborhoods. And one of the things that has surprises people every time I go to an audience and I say, are you aware that in most of your city you can build a mansion on vacant land but not a fourplex? People are shocked. San Francisco, considered the most tenant town in America, half the buildable land in the city, you can build a mansion but not an apartment, and we're considered pro-tenant. And we have apartments that were all built in all of these cities before they were rendered illegal in the 60s, 70s, and 80s through zoning changes, which not coincidentally in many cases followed the end of racial covenants. So it used to be you could prevent certain people from living in your neighborhood because of racial covenants. When that was thrown out in the 60s, suddenly all these neighborhoods decided we don't want apartments in our neighborhood. There is a racial subtext.
And can you describe what's a typical NIMBY that is not in my backyard scenario? The residents sort of learn. It almost seems like there's a surreptitious element that they learn that there are some plans for a vacant lot or for conversion of some kind, and they really get active. It's quite something to see, actually, isn't it?
I think the problem, Anthony, has been that we've allowed a process that rewards undemocratic procedures. So we have neighborhood organizations, many of which are funded in places like Denver and Austin and used to be in Seattle. They're funded by the city, and yet they're going out and opposing city housing policies. And it's Thursday at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The millennials are all working. Many people are having been home with their kids, but the boomers have plenty of time. Many are retired, and they can spend as much time as they need to on a Thursday afternoon. And I just recently wrote an article about how in actual elections, not these fake showing up at Thursday at 2, but elections on election days in November, the pro-housing issues and the pro-housing candidates won overwhelmingly last November and keep winning. So when the whole city can vote, they want housing. But we've allowed for decades a small, predominantly white group of homeowners dictate our housing policy.
So it's at that neighborhood level where they can control the discourse in that way. So how does Yes in My Backyard work? What's the difference? How have they been able to achieve power and influence?
Well, I write about YIMBY movements in many cities and generation priced out. And the reason is that what's so significant is that for the first time in 30 years, we have people at these hearings who are testifying for housing who aren't connected to the developer. I've been involved in development projects in San Francisco, and when we had a project, we would bring the developer, we'd bring our people out who are connected to the project, who are going to live in the project. But these are people who are now just coming out saying, I'm in the neighborhood and I'm for housing. And I think what millennials are coming out of college with huge debt. They're paying exorbitant rents. Meanwhile, they're very frustrated. They can't get affordable housing in the cities, and we have teachers and nurses and firefighters all priced out of the cities where they work. Meanwhile, we have boomer homeowners sitting on places they paid very little for in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, and they're making profits like you can't believe. I often say that the best job you can have in San Francisco is be a single-family home in a place like Noe Valley. Your values go up $60,000 a year, and you don't even have to go to work.
Right. Yes, there's this idea of the home voter, which a colleague. Bill Fischel wrote about, that suggests that when you've got that home ownership and you've got that prized house in Noe Valley, you're going to do a lot to make sure that the property values just continue to increase and that nothing changes about your situation.
And I'll tell you a point that many people listening may not realize, and I write about this. I say in Generation Priced Out, one of the most important things that you can do to deal with this crisis is stop local elections, off-year elections, where you have a very low voter turnout. You have voter turnouts in Los Angeles before they change their to state and to coincide with state and national. They had voter turnouts of 13 and 15%. Who do you think is voting in those city council races? It's 80% homeowners. So when people say that they're not listening to their district, they're listening to the people who vote in those small turnout elections. You have to end those and coincide all local elections with state and national so the tenant vote has more power.
All right, let's look at this idea of, we'll get a little bit academic for a minute, about increasing supply and how that actually has an impact on the ground. Several studies talk about this idea of filtering, that if you build even luxury housing, that frees up different kinds of housing elsewhere. But other studies are inconclusive at best. The laws of supply and demand don't seem to be manifesting on the ground, and the studies, we just don't have the evidence to say that increasing supply gets the job done.
Well, first of all, it depends what the job is. I mean, I think we have to take a step back and talk about what luxury housing is. To me, luxury housing is what was built in Chelsea, $10 million units with private swimming pools, all that housing they're building in Manhattan and those high rises where the units start at $5 million. That's obviously luxury housing. But what we've had happen in all the cities I write about is any project that isn't subsidized by the government is called luxury housing. And what I show in Generation Priced Out is how 95% of the housing that was sold for over $1 million in like 2017 to 2015 was existing housing. The luxury housing in San Francisco, the biggest supply is existing single-family homes. It's not the condo in most projects. Yes, there are luxury projects in San Francisco downtown, but the vast majority of new construction sells for less than a house in Haight-Ashbury. And yet we make believe, we play this game where the only so what's happened is it's been a strategy to stop any housing from being built because it's all deemed luxury. And yet when a single-family home changes hands, you don't hear a word.
And the housing market is also highly segmented, neighborhood by neighborhood, in some ways block by block. And so it's not responsive in that in the theoretical way. I think, would you agree that economists would suggest that that would work when you introduce new housing supply at a transit station, for example? We have seen quite a bit of gentrification, have we not?
Well, we could get in a long debate about that. The notion that we shouldn't build public transit because it's gentrifying, it doesn't make any sense. And I've made that point in my book, is that you have to support public transit. If you don't support public transit, you're supporting climate change. And I don't support climate change, and nobody should. So the notion that we're better off with people driving, the reality is that the people driving the hour and a half from Sacramento to San Francisco are not the rich. They would rather live in San Francisco and take public transit than have to spend 3 hours round trip each day driving. So we need public transit, and I think there's so many arguments people use just because they're anti-change or anti-development. Now they've come out against public transit saying it's gentrifying. It really doesn't make sense. It's not an argument that we should be fostering.
Or transit and transit-oriented development, right?
Yeah. Well, I think that what's mystifying is that people some people on the left have become this extremely anti-development. Politics defines them. They don't care that teachers can't live, and you say, why can't? Well, they can live somewhere else. They don't care that teachers are priced out. They don't care that young people are suffering. It's just we have too many people in our town. You hear that in Cambridge last night in the battle over an affordable housing overlay. And a really important point that your colleague Rick Jacobus has made better than anyone in the country: inclusionary housing which is from new construction, where there's a mandated requirement number of units, say 10 to 20%. That is the only way a working and middle-class family will ever be able to live in most San Francisco neighborhoods. And let me repeat that because often people don't get it. There's basically a no non-rich people allowed sign posted outside the Haight-Ashbury, Noe Valley, progressive Bernal Heights. These are the most progressive voting neighborhoods in San Francisco, and you can't live there without paying $1 million or $2 or $3 million unless you have inclusionary housing, and you only get inclusionary housing if you build new construction. That is a fact. So the people who say we don't want any new housing, what they're saying is we don't want anyone but the rich or the children of rich to live in our neighborhood in the future.
Well, let's talk about inclusionary housing. It has emerged as a potential solution in many cities across the country. It's in use in several cities, and again, it's this. In some places it's voluntary, but let's go with the requirement that, say, 15% of new residential development has to be affordable to people, say, making 80% of area median income. So that's inclusionary housing, or inclusionary zoning, it's sometimes called. Some parts of the YIMBY movement will tell you that that's another barrier to have those affordability requirements in place.
I agree. I know those people, and I disagree with that. And I would say I would not call inclusionary housing a solution. My Generation Priced Out, the whole book is based on the fact that there's no one solution. There's many things cities must do. Inclusionary housing is one of them. And when you don't do it, like Oakland, California is not doing it. Oakland's having the biggest building boom of its history, and they don't have any inclusionary units coming online. I'm predicting that when those units open up, people are going to say, wait a second, we have a whole building of market rate units. Why didn't we do inclusionary? But they didn't, and it's a big mistake. People will say, well, it's only 10 or 20%, but you know what? That's a better chance. That's better than 0%. And I think getting working and middle-class people to have the opportunity to live in high-opportunity neighborhoods is really valuable, even if it's only 10 or 20%. So it's one of the tools cities need to do. Let me just mention one thing also. Many states ban inclusionary housing. So what Seattle did, what Austin's moving toward doing, what Minneapolis, a number of cities, is you can use a density bonus to say to the developer, we'll give you 2 or 3 more floors in exchange for having some affordable and also having rent control protections. That's a way to circumvent the state prohibitions. And I'm a very big supporter of that in Generation Priced Out. And like right now, for example, in Austin, Councilmember Greg Cesar has a plan, which I believe will eventually happen, citywide 6 stories if 50% is affordable. And the affordable would be funded by a bond they passed. So I think we need to look at density bonuses. That's almost a more valuable tool than inclusionary housing.
Yeah, it's a good point. Something that we're quite interested in around the Lincoln Institute is this idea of value capture and land value capture. And that's essentially an example of that. If you're the local government and you bestow upon developers this capacity to build more, height and density, then you can expect something in return, essentially. And that's more affordable units or the certain percentage of affordable units. And we really think that that's basically grounded in the principles of value capture. The government takes all kinds of actions and makes all kinds of investments on behalf of the public that make a lot of people rich.
Yeah, and I did a deal in San Francisco for the rebuilding. There was 360 units at 8th and Market Street in this thing called Trinity Plaza, and the deal that we worked out after a lot of fighting was that they can build 1,900 units on site, which is great. 360 will be rent controlled. Now, people always say, wait, you can't have, under state law in California, you can't have rent control under new construction. Well, as part of the deal, as part of the development agreement, the owner agreed to a deed restriction on to maintain all the previously rent-controlled units. So you can do a lot of things that people don't realize through development agreements.
Right, yeah, and benefits, special assessments. There is a way to recover that value that really belongs to the public, essentially.
Let me just make one point, Anthony. It's very important to listeners to understand. whenever we talk about value recapture, I hear people say, well, we're upzoning, we're doing this. If we're going to upzone, like under SB 50 in California, all these property owners are making a benefit. But what they don't talk about is all the benefits homeowners reap, financial benefits, by not allowing housing. We make believe that doesn't exist. And it's many homeowners who don't want to talk about that. And I do talk about it in my book because it's a real fact that keeping the status quo profits people too, not just new development.
So you mean like single-family homeowners
who don't allow anything to be built in their neighborhood, so their
so
values
it stays
go
right
way
the
up.
same, and
Right,
values go
and
way
they're
up.
making the $60,000 a year NOI value without going to work.
Now, we've been talking about San Francisco. We have also talked a lot about New York, and we were chatting that those two cities might well be outliers in the end. And I'm wondering what other cities are doing a good job at tackling
I
this?
just did an interview for Denverite online, which you can check, where I said that Denver's doing a great job and no one talks about it. You have groups like the Urban Land Conservancy just acquiring land on transit sites, affordable housing in gentrifying neighborhoods, which you need to do. And they build a lot of housing in Denver. Denver exceeds Seattle. They exceed anywhere, I think, per capita. And nobody talks about it because it's Denver, I guess. Minneapolis now gets attention, national attention, because they broke through exclusionary zoning. But Denver's doing great work. And Austin was at a crossroads. They had a very successful election last fall, which really brought a lot of housing people. It not only brought housing people to office, it brought a bond of $250 million bond. It defeated an anti-housing measure. It defeated strongly anti-housing candidates. It was a really, which side are you on? I think this year we're going to see some very positive land use changes in Austin, which really needs it. So I think there's some cities we don't often hear about. San Diego has now become the YIMBY capital of America. People forget San Diego is the second biggest city in California. It's one of the 10 biggest cities in the United States. And its mayor said he basically wants to get rid of the NIMBYs and wants to turn into a YIMBY town, which is and things are just happening. They got rid of parking minimums. So I think San Diego, which I discussed in Generation Priced Out, and I talk about it before these events happen, but I kind of lay the groundwork, is a place that you can just see how quickly things can change in the right direction. There's a lot of momentum in a lot of cities, but when you get the mayor on board, it really gets things moving, and the grassroots.
Yeah, that does seem to be what happened in Minneapolis politically. How about, very quickly, a couple of other places? Seattle?
Well, Seattle finally just this week concluded their long process. And it's interesting. I wrote I have a whole chapter on Seattle, and I talk about all the great things they did. It's interesting what can happen when things are delayed by opponents of new housing, lawsuits. And so by the time their HALA, Great Housing Affordability Plan, finally passed unanimously, their maximum housing prior to the MHA plan, all these great things took so long that people got frustrated and said, wait, why haven't we seen the benefits? Well, actually, because it was held up for 4 years to get it done. It passed this week, and people will start seeing it. And again, a lot of folks are saying they shouldn't have let the single-family home neighborhoods off the hook, which they did. That can be revisited. But Seattle is doing a lot of very good things. They're building a lot of transit. And it's one of the frustrations of this business of trying to solve the housing crisis that the solutions take a long time. Mayor Garcetti in LA got a $1.2 billion sales tax passed for homeless, and 2 years later he was being protested because no units had come up. Well, guess what? If you pass a bond, you can't, within 2 years from the passage of the bond, see housing built. It doesn't work that fast, even in Seattle, because you have to sell the bonds. So that's the frustration, because people vote for something, and a year later they don't see any results, and they say, well, what was the point?
And of course, with a number of these populations, whether it's moderate income or communities of color or other low-income groups, there's no tomorrow. You can't wait. You have to pay the rent today.
Well, I think what really we showed and what sort of people say to me about Generation Priced Out, I wish you'd written that book 10 years earlier. And I said, well, the book wouldn't have had a market 10 years earlier because most of the cities I write about weren't pricing people out 10 years earlier. What happened was suddenly in 2012, 30 years of not building enough housing caught up with all these cities. And so trying to reverse that in the space of a short time frame is not easy, especially when we still have all these really bad rules like in San Francisco where you can appeal anything and endless delays and things take 4 years from application to construction. Seattle does it as fast as you can do it, and I think the model is really Seattle, where it can almost be a year. Denver, the cities that really care about building housing are doing so.
So as we wrap up, let me ask you, given all of that, are you optimistic about the ability of cities to solve this affordable housing crisis?
I'm actually very optimistic, and since my book only came out in November, but I keep hearing from reporters saying, gee, you wrote about this, now look what's happening. A lot of things are happening and moving positive. I would say the biggest issue is not being aggressive enough. I mean, it's great to have triplexes in single-family neighborhoods, but when you have a big gap, you need more than triplexes often in many areas of many cities. And so we can't aim too low. And the message I'd say to people listening who agree with me is that homeowner opposition is just as strong to small incremental changes as to big ones. So you might as well try the big ones.
Right. Shoot high, aim high. Randy Shaw, author of Generation Priced Out, Who Gets to Live in the New Urban America. Thank you so much for being part of the Land Matters podcast.
Thank you.
Well, that's it for this episode. We're going to be looking at all kinds of other elements of successful cities, preparing for climate change, managing water resources, dealing with slums worldwide, the revitalization of post-industrial cities, and much more. We're finding answers in land. So join us next time for Land Matters, the podcast of the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy. I'm Anthony Flynn. Thanks for listening.